Yes, my name is Nate Toering. I am the Chief of Interpretation and Education at Cape Lookout National Seashore. I'm going to be talking today about the Cape Lookout Lighthouse, and I changed mine a little bit, so as she said, past and present, but I added future because I'm going to talk about what some of the long-term plans are for the lighthouse going into the next 5-10 year range and what we're looking to do. My goal with this is to talk about the lighthouse. I may go a little bit off topic and talk about different individuals and things like that, but really the core of the focus, come on up, the core of the focus is going to be specifically about the lighthouse itself. So my connection to the lighthouse really started in 2017. I was working at another national park as a park ranger, and I got a call out saying that they needed somebody to come to Cape Lookout for 6 weeks and help get their lighthouse up and running. And I thought, at the time I was down in Pender County at Morse Creek National Battlefield, I thought 6-week vacation, out on the beach, wild horses, working a lighthouse, what could go wrong? And so this is me, May 10th, 2017, happy as a clam on top of the lighthouse. This is the first time I ever climbed that lighthouse, and I was really awestruck from that point on forward. Around week 5 of that 6-week detail, the person who had previously been in my position, the Chief of Interpretation, asked if I was interested in sticking around for a little bit longer, and ultimately this 6-week work detail turned into 6 years of my career and 3 different positions at the park. So for the previous 5 years or so, I was the lead park ranger for our education division and also managed our volunteer program. And in January of this year, I took over as the Chief of Interpretation and Education for the entire park. Woo! So let's talk about lighthouses. And I know I said I'm going to talk specifically about the Cape Lookout Lighthouse, but we're going to talk about lighthouses in general. What are they and why do we use them? And the simplest thing that I can think of is that they are warnings, right? It's a warning that says, do not run into what I am standing on. And I've got the Lighthouse of Alexandria here. This is the lighthouse that was built right around 250 BC. It is essentially the precursor to all modern lighthouses in terms of a very large tower with a light at the top. But lighthouses and that visible warning have existed for thousands of years, right? You can build a bonfire on top of a hill, and that can serve that warning of a lighthouse. So again, I know I said I was going to talk about the Cape Lookout Lighthouse. I wasn't going to get too off topic, but let's talk about this guy that died 300 years before the lighthouse was ever built. I'll get there, I promise. This is Theodorus de Bry. He was born in the early 1500s in the Holy Roman Empire, right what would be the border of the Netherlands and Belgium. And he actually has a pretty interesting role in our area here. So de Bry was a very talented publisher and engraver, which at the time is a very critical role for disseminating information. This is actually a self-portrait he made. One of my favorite things, I don't know if you can read it down here, Null sans souci down at the bottom, which roughly translates to nobody or nothing without worries. And I'm like, that is totally 1500s Holy Roman Empire right there, sitting with a skull in his hand and nobody without worries. But de Bry plays a really important role, and he ties in to watercolors from John White. So this is the same one as the governor of the Roanoke Colony fame. So John White comes, interacts with the Native Americans in the area, and he makes these fantastic watercolors of those interactions. And de Bry takes those watercolors and turns them into engravings that can be then used to mass print copies of those watercolors. Obviously, it would take forever to duplicate individual watercolors, so this is our mass production for that time. And he actually creates a whole book called A Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia. So side by side, we've got the watercolor from White and then de Bry's engraving. And you can actually see that de Bry has even pulled more detail out of it, and he's reading written accounts and then adding detail based on these written accounts. I promise we're going to get to a lighthouse here shortly. It's coming. So this right here, raise your hand if you've seen this map before. Nice. Only a couple. All right, so this is the White de Bry map. One really interesting thing about this map, if you look on here, so Occidentis, it has west as the upward direction on the map. The only other maps I've ever found that use west as the upward direction are made from people like de Bry during his time period. So basically these Dutch cartographers from the 1500s, for whatever reason, used west as the upward direction. But I'm going to go ahead and flip it into something that you will make a little more sense out of. So now, as you start to look up here, you can see Norfolk, Virginia. We're starting to get into the Outer Banks down here. And if you get all the way down here, that's Cape Lookout. And it's probably hard to see. It just looks like a little dark blur down here. But just like CSI, I'm going to say enhance, rotate. And we've got Cape Lookout, the point down here, and then all these little dots out here. And DeBry has written Promontorium Tremendum, which roughly translates to the horrible headland. Another translation is Cape Terrible. I am so glad that we went with horrible headland and I didn't have to say, welcome to Cape Terrible National Seashore. Cape Lookout just rolls off the tongue a little bit better. Back to my point though, so this map is really, it's the first widely dispersed map that we have of our area. And DeBry has gone through the trouble to indicate that this particular area, the Cape Lookout Shoals, is incredibly dangerous. So this is our first warning, and that's sort of my theme here, that lighthouses are a warning. This is really our first warning, talking particularly about Cape Lookout and the Cape Lookout Shoals. So this is a more modern map. We actually sell a copy of this down at our gift shop, but this is shipwrecks of North Carolina. The one thing I want to point out is this big cluster of shipwrecks out here on the Cape Lookout Shoals. So when you think of an area that really needs a lighthouse, right? If you have people running aground, that's a problem and warrants a lighthouse. If you have people running aground 10 miles offshore, you are really needing some better warning than just a chart that says Promontorium Tremendum. You need something that's visible, that's going to reach out and actually be seen by people well offshore. So as we're getting into more of the modern age, I'm going to jump into late 18th, early 19th century shipwrecks. These are not all of them. I just grabbed a few from this time window and threw them up here. But these are ships that are running around specifically right in the Cape Lookout area. So this is impacting shipping, it's impacting commerce. People are writing angry letters to the newfound government, depending on what time you are in here. You can see we're getting into the post-revolutionary era, saying that this is a problem. We need to do something about this. And Congress is receptive to that. So we get to 1804. I pulled from an old newspaper. I think this is a newspaper clipping from 1807, 1808. But indicates here that at the pitch of Cape Lookout in North Carolina, we're appropriating $20,000 to build a lighthouse. So $20,000, today's dollars, 2023 is roughly $500,000 to build a lighthouse. So I think money, I don't know if it would stretch that far with $500,000 right now with everything going on, but that's what they appropriated in 1804, and they actually purchased a plot of land to do that. So an original plot of 4 acres. This is actually a little bit older map that indicates an extension that they were going to purchase to extend the amount of land that this original lighthouse is built on. This little drawing right here, that is the only drawing or picture or any kind of first-hand account that we have from somebody who actually saw this original lighthouse. So the lighthouse is constructed in 1812. We have this one sketch. We've got a bunch of written documentation about what it looks like, and then we have artist representations. This one happens to be wrong, but they're pretty close. It's not too bad. So they've got what looks like brick on the outside. The actual lighthouse had a brick interior, but wood on the outside. It's very strange. In the original documents, if you read them, it says you should build it and paint it white and brown. But then we have written accounts that it is white and red. So this is actually probably a little more accurate. You don't see the brick on the outside. It's wood plating on the outside. So it's about 95 feet tall. They build it on a hill to try and make the most out of a relatively short lighthouse. This shows the keeper's quarters that was built there with it. And ultimately, this, I think, does a good example of showing it next to something that you guys would recognize. So this is our modern Cape Lookout Lighthouse. This is the much shorter 1812 lighthouse, but appropriately shown on a hill here to give it an extra 10 or so feet of height to be seen out a little bit further. It has a pretty rudimentary light system at the top. They're using at this time what they call a chandelier. So it's essentially 12 or 13 lights in a ring, and has simple reflectors. Think like each light has a little mirror behind it. So it's not the best lighthouse. It's not really serving that role of a warning too well. So my question is, if you are a short dimly lit lighthouse? Is that better than no lighthouse? It's up for debate. There's a lot of people that would say no, and we'll get into that. What's going on really is that you're getting these nautical charts. The nautical charts say here at Cape Lookout there is a lighthouse. And as you are traveling up and down the coast looking for that lighthouse, you have the potential to actually hit ground before you ever even see the lighthouse from where you're at. So that's the problem with these shoals that extend so far out. So it's too short, it's pretty dim, and within a few years of it being finished, within about 8 years of it being finished, so it's finished in 1812. In 1820, Congress goes through a major repair project. So there's some other stuff going on. If within 8 years you're already into very serious repairs on it, it's probably got some other issues as well. On top of that, it's got pretty much nonstop complaints from the mariners who are traveling up and down the coast, writing, saying all kinds of things about it. So as time goes by, we get into the 1840s. Congress is now getting a little bit more serious about lighthouse reform. Our very pitiful 1812 lighthouse is not the only sad excuse for a lighthouse on the Atlantic coast. This is really happening all up and down the seaboard, with people writing in saying, you really have to improve this, we need to do better. Ships are running aground, and Congress is definitely interested in how much is being lost in terms of loss of human life, but also the economic factors of shipping being lost in the way. So they get very serious. They appoint this man here, Thornton Jenkins, as essentially an investigator to go out and talk to some of these people who are complaining, learn a little bit more about what's going on, and then give feedback to Congress so that they can make an appropriate decision on it. And so he does. He conducts all kinds of hearings, interviews mariners, really goes out and asks for feedback. And feedback he gets. So H.J. Harstein, at the time, is a lieutenant in the Navy in charge of a mail steamer called the Illinois. And so he writes, and I'm gonna quote this one directly to make sure I get it right. The lights of Hatteras, Lookout, Canaveral, and Cape Florida, if not improved, had better be dispensed with, as the navigator is apt to run ashore looking for them. So exactly what I'm talking about. You're looking at charts for these lighthouses, they're short, the lights are dim, and you will hit shoals before you ever even realize that you're even near land. So Harstein, and I don't want to dive too much into crazy tangents, but Harstein and Jenkins both end up serving in the Civil War. So this is another 17 years later on opposite sides. So Jenkins is a Union fleet commander during the blockade, and Harstein is actually at Fort Sumter as a fleet commander defending Fort Sumter. Harstein also, in between those two, was a really prominent Arctic explorer. I don't want to go on too many tangents, but crazy thing, he got a sword from the Queen of England and stuff. It's really interesting. He's got a very interesting life story, but I digress. I'll go back. So Lighthouse Board. Congress is very serious about improving lighthouses in the United States. All these complaints, they've appointed Jenkins to go out and get all this information. Jenkins is returning, saying, yes, we have lots of problems, identifying specific lights that are deficient and need to be improved upon. And so they establish a board in 1851. This board consists of, you have 2 high-ranking naval officers, you have 2 members of the Army Corps of Engineers, you have a group of citizen scientists, and then you have a naval secretary, essentially, who records all that information. So this picture here, it's a little bit later. It's 1896, but it's the only picture I could actually find of the Lighthouse Board. But the Lighthouse Board goes through, reviews all of this information from Jenkins and the written information from others that came in, and basically their job is to actually take that directly to Congress and make suggestions on what needs to happen. And so they go to Congress, and lo and behold, they tell Congress, Cape Lookout's 1812 lighthouse is short, and its light is not very bright. No surprise here. But what they say is that we need to just completely replace it. We can't just add a brighter light. It needs a full modern replacement with modern technology. And this, again, happens all up and down the East Coast of the United States, not just here. It's basically everywhere. And so Congress they appropriate $45,000, so in today's money, about $1.5 million for the construction of a modern lighthouse at Cape Lookout. So that's again, 1.5 million. I don't know if it would really go that far in today's dollars in terms of constructing a 163-foot tall lighthouse. So the 1859 lighthouse is using this schematic. One thing I will say about it, this is a generalized lighthouse schematic for lighthouses similar to ours. It does indicate an oil house, an exterior building on the side of it. We did not do that design with our 1859 lighthouse. It was basically scrapped in part of the planning phase. I always wondered, like with most government projects, if they didn't get 90% of the way done and then it came time to build this and they were like, we have no more money, just stick a door and some stairs on it. But I don't have any evidence for that. But either way, we didn't get that part. We just got a standard staircase. So, like I said, happening all up and down the east coast of the United States. You have these much taller brick lighthouses being built all around the same time period in this pre-Civil War era, 1858, 1859 into 1860. And you're seeing that they're all in excess of 150 feet tall. They all have that very similar tapering brick design as they go up, following very similar patterns, but each lighthouse always has its own unique things on the inside. So, we've solved one problem. We've made it taller. What's our second problem? Light's not very bright. Right. So we're gonna go off on a little side. We're gonna talk briefly about this gentleman. So this is Augustin Fresnel, and I'm sure I'm messing up the French pronunciation of that, but he made an invention. He invented something that they called the invention that saved a million ships, and that is, of course, the Fresnel lens. This is one right here, and this is probably the best graphic I can show for how a Fresnel lens works. So you essentially have a bunch of angled prisms that line up. So as that light from the lantern is spreading out 360 degrees in every angle, this lens completely encapsulates the light, catches those beams of light, and focuses them all right out on the horizon where those ships will be. So this particular invention allowed lighthouses across the country and really across the world to be much more efficient at sending light out. So this is the one that goes in Cape Lookout. It's called a first order Fresnel lens. I think the first one in the world was installed in the 1820s, about 1825. So this is still modern technology, still state of the art, but not necessarily the first ones going out. There's different orders of Fresnel lenses. I won't get into it too much, but in confusing French fashion, the number one is the largest, and then the numbers get bigger, but the lenses get smaller. So like a third order might be something you'd see on one of the Great Lakes or something, versus a first order is going to be generally on these major coastal areas. So moving forward, this is our first order Fresnel lens. This is it in storage, 1970s at some point. I don't know if you can see it, but this is the only image I know of the lighthouse where we actually still have the Fresnel lens in it very clearly visible. And this is a shot that I think was taken in the either really early 1940s or something in that range. So again, across the board, all these lighthouses are also getting these first order Fresnel lenses. So we're checking both of these boxes in terms of a proficient and efficient warning symbol of a much taller lighthouse with now a much brighter light. And even if the light source itself is still the same amount of light being emitted, that Fresnel lens allows you to really amplify how well it goes out to a ship on the horizon. 1860. So that original 1812 lighthouse, they now have their brand new brick, beautiful lighthouse. What do you do with the old one? Well, this right here is a note that says, why don't we turn it into a house? Which is exactly what they do. So they take that old lighthouse and they basically sort of chop it up and turn it into housing for the keepers who are out there, which I think is a pretty fantastic use of available resources, right? You're out on a barrier island, you don't have that much. Well, we're not using that thing anymore. Just stick a door on it and call it a day. And they did. Probably not the most comfortable housing, though, if you think about it. It's got a, basically a stone floor in there, so I doubt you're having the greatest of times, but making the best of all things. So we're into 1860. You can probably guess what's coming next, right? So we're into the Civil War. And we definitely have some impacts for us at the Cape Lookout Lighthouse relevant to the Civil War. And there's really two big ones that I'm going to talk about. So the first one is a dark time at Cape Lookout. You'll see what I did there in a second. So the light from the Cape is removed. Yeah, the Confederate Lighthouse Bureau basically comes in and very wisely says we are going to pull out all of the lights and Fresnel lenses from all of the lighthouses that we are in control of. And this really serves two purposes. So one is safekeeping, right? So think of this thing as like a modern supercomputer, right? It's very tough to come by, incredibly expensive. If it was to be destroyed, it'd be a massive loss. And the second one is in terms of military strategy, right? So in early 1861, Lincoln basically signs a letter sending the Union Navy out to blockade the southern states. And when that happens, they now are very likely using these navigational aids. So in terms of the Confederacy, there is a benefit to removing them, because now, potentially, these naval blockade ships coming from the north are going to run aground on the Cape Lookout shoals and not come down and blockade these southern ports. So it's really a dual purpose, and it's a good thing that it got out of there, because the next thing I talk about would have been absolutely catastrophic, and that is April 3rd, 1864. We have a group of Confederate saboteurs sneak into the lighthouse. So this is after it's basically transitioned over to Union control in that area. They sneak into the lighthouse. They bring with them powders of explosive, and their intent is to destroy the lighthouse. So we have there's technically 3 reports about what happened. There are 2 Confederate reports, the first report and the second report. So the first Confederate report says, we snuck in, we blew up both of the lighthouses, and they can't be repaired. Interestingly, I heard in researching this and talking to a colleague that we think that report was actually submitted before they even made it out there to do the sabotage attempt. And then shortly thereafter, there's a follow-up report that says, well, we didn't quite destroy it, but it was because the powder. We had bad powder. If we had good powder, it would have been destroyed. So the Union report says that it was, there's some substantial damage, but everything's repairable, and doesn't even mention the 1812 lighthouse. And we are pretty confident that the 1812 lighthouse did not get destroyed because it gets mentioned on into the late 1860s. So it's likely still standing at this point. The image that I have here, so this is actually an architectural drawing that shows repairs to the lighthouse. So we have an iron spiral staircase in there. This explosion basically destroys a whole segment of stairs in the interior of the lighthouse, blows all the glass at the top out. You actually occasionally find pieces of this original glass in the sand out there. But what happens is, because during the war, iron is in such short supply and being utilized for war purposes, they rebuild with just standard wooden staircases inside in order to preserve that iron. All right, so we know that the lens has made it out, and I'm going to talk very briefly. So this is just a couple of days after Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox. We have Sherman's forces basically moving in to Raleigh, and Governor Vance, who is very wary of what had happened in Atlanta the previous November, where basically Atlanta nearly got burned to the ground. He is very wary of that same outcome, and essentially sends out messengers to Sherman and says, we completely surrender, like we do not want to resist, and is basically doing his best to spare the city. And it is very likely that this action resulted in our lens still being in one piece, because they do find it. It had been stored in Raleigh since 1862, July of 1862, and it's in pretty good condition. There's a few of the prism panels, the glass is missing. There's a couple pieces that are broken, but all in all, it's in pretty good shape. But because there's some damage, and because all of these Americans, even though they utilize this technology, they didn't build it, right? So we're sending it back to the manufacturer. So we actually pack it up, we ship it back to France, and they do the repairs on the Fresnel lens and send it back to us fully refurbished about a year later. So we've had some damage to the lighthouse. We've got to put this new lens in. We basically go to Congress. Congress dishes out some additional funds. They dish out about $20,000. So at the time, we're looking at just under $500,000 to do repairs to the lighthouse, not only for general stuff, but also for the fact that we had the entire staircase on a couple sections blown out. So they do major repairs. Right around 1870, we're back in a pre-Civil War status, where it's in pretty good shape again. So prior to this point, before I go to the next slide, what fuel source do you think we're using in lighthouses up till this point? Any guesses? Oil. Oh, you guys are too good. I heard somebody up here was talking about dolphin oil or something like that, because it doesn't, it has a tendency to not freeze at lower temperatures. But you're exactly right. We're using whale oil up till this point, and this next slide will make a whole bunch more sense why I brought that up, because I had a former colleague who loved to say that John D. Rockefeller saved the whales, and there is at least a little bit of truth to that. So the modern rise of petroleum-based fuels suddenly made harvesting whales less economically feasible. It was much easier to just, plant into the ground and pump oil out of the ground and make your fuel sources that way. So in 1873, we switch over to petroleum-based fuels. We switch over to kerosene at that point. A lot of other things going on in 1873. So with lighthouses, we don't call them paint jobs, we call them day marks. This is our identifying characteristic during the day. So prior to 1873, so 1859 to 1872, the Cape Lookout Lighthouse is just solid red brick, no paint on it whatsoever. The problem that comes up in the post-Civil War era is that we have two other lighthouses, Body Island and Hatteras, that pop up in very close proximity, and they use a very similar design. So if you're navigating up and down the coast and you see a tall brick lighthouse, am I looking at Hatteras? Am I looking at I don't know. I have no idea, right? So that is actually what we do when we start doing the day marks. And I have the original document here, and it's probably really hard to see. The one thing you might be able to make, so it says Cape Lookout. It's kind of burnt and disappearing. But lookout and diagonal checkers. So some of the rangers that work out there will refer to those black and white diamonds. What most people say, we actually refer to them as diagonal checkers. And that is a throwback to this original document that actually spells out all three lighthouses, how they should be painted in order to be identified during the day. Most of you probably know this, but there's an additional navigational aid built in to lighthouse diamonds. So where the black and white meet, you have a north and south, and obviously on either side is east and west. The other thing that works into these, and really all of them, the further out you get, you will, as the lighthouse starts to dip under the horizon, you can roughly gauge your distance based on how many of those diamonds are visible. So some additional navigational aids just built into the paint job, or the day mark as we call it. And in 1873, one other major change is the keeper's quarters. So the same one that's sitting out there. That quarters is constructed. If you remember, just a few years prior, about 13 years prior, you had them moving into the old 1812 lighthouse. So I'm sure they are very thrilled with all the work going on out there. But this has to be the thing that makes them the happiest, is that they're moving into actually a nice structure out there. So I have tons of photographs of the lighthouse and the area around there, the light station as we call it. This is one of my favorite though, and it's because it references a plot map. So this is a plot map. This is actually published in the early 1900s, but it is surveyed in like 1893, but somebody goes out in 1899 with this earlier survey, and they match up certain locations. There's no way you're going to be able to read this, but this right here says camera station number 1. So let's start at the keeper's quarters, is this building here. You have the lighthouse down here. You have the original 1812 keeper's quarters still standing right here. And this little mound right here is roughly where the 1812 lighthouse stood. Now at this point in 1899, it's gone. But we have camera station number 1, and way down on the beach, down here, we have camera station number 2. And this is why I love these, because it matches up the photos with the plot map of what it looked like at the time. So this is one that's basically sitting at the area where the 1812 lighthouse was, looking back at the lighthouse. And you can see this relatively, at that point, new keeper's quarters there, but you are absent some of the other things that you might notice out there, i.e. the old summer kitchen and the generator building that will be on the other side of it. And then there's just a nice long wide view, but the reason I love this particular photograph is it is the only photograph that I'm aware of where we actually have an image, a picture of that original 1812 keeper's quarters still standing. During this time window, we think it's being used basically as like an excess building by the Signal Corps, but it's had some substantial damage because it's really front and center on the beach. So it's basically has one of the walls is warped in. It's not of much use. The only other thing I'll bring attention to is this little rectangle right here. That's the original outhouse from the 1812 keeper's quarters. Still standing. 1907, we start getting into some quality of life improvements, making things a little bit better for the people who are out there. Probably a little tough to see on here, but this is another one of these plot maps. You've got the keeper's quarters here, the lighthouse. We're adding another building right here and another small building next to it. That's these right here. So this is that 1873 keeper's quarters. This is the one that's still standing out there. This is the 1907 keeper's quarters, just to the left of it, and you can just barely make out the summer kitchen and its roof peeking out from behind that building. The other thing you'll notice that wasn't in that previous photograph is this right here, where at the time, that is an oil storage facility. So if you remember that first drawing of the lighthouse, we had an oil storage attached to it. We've actually built one on the exterior of it. Seems like that would be a little bit safer than storing a bunch of oil inside the enclosed brick lighthouse itself. So we get some quality of life improvements. Now we're going to move into actually upgrading the light itself. So a couple different things. 1912, we have the introduction of an IOV, so incandescent oil vapor light. Has anybody ever seen one of those Coleman lanterns that has the little bag in it and the bag lights up, but it doesn't light on fire? It's like magic. I don't know how they work. That's what this thing is, an incandescent oil vapor light. The other thing that happens right at this time, so all the way up until 1914, the Cape Lookout lighthouses, both of them, are a static singular light. So the light is on, and it's on the whole time it's on. Doesn't turn, doesn't flicker on and off. It's just a steady light. So in 1914, again, at this point, still utilizing petroleum-based fuels, you don't have that same ability like we have to flip a light switch on and off. It's a little bit trickier when it's actually a flame. So they come up with a highly engineered method to add a flash pattern to the lighthouse. And it is kind of crazy. It's a giant clockwork device. So this is the light all the way at the top. This is a pendulum. So in the center of the Cape Lookout Lighthouse, there's a big open column that runs the whole length of it. Down that column, they have a weight. That weight very slowly descends down the column, and it actually has these two things. So see these on either side of the light here, you have these thin little things with the bolts in them. So that is called an occulting device. And so as that heavy pendulum goes downward, it works gears and spins this occulting device very slowly around the light. And it creates a flash pattern. So if you're offshore, as those occulting devices cross in front of the light, it briefly becomes dark. It has a really weird flash pattern. I think it's 2 seconds off, 2 seconds on, 2 seconds off, 9 seconds on. It's a 15-second cycle with short and long durations of light. But it's the first one that identifies the lighthouse at night. So we think about that day mark, right? You see those diagonal checkers, boom, Cape Lookout light. What about at night? I just see a light. So now with flash patterns, you can add, hey, it's 2 on, 2 on, 2 off, 2 on, 9 on. And then with a chart at night, you can identify, okay, I at least know I am near the Cape Lookout light or whichever light you are next to. So this allows daytime and nighttime identification, which is a fantastic improvement on just a steady light. So we're going to bump up a little bit more into the modern era. So 1933, we're really getting into heavy-duty modernization of the lighthouse. So one of my favorite things about the modernization of it is this light setup right here. So this is our first electric light bulb. You can see, as I put here, we're now going over to diesel-powered. So we are utilizing generators and using electricity. So that means we now can just flip a switch on and off. No more need for an occulting device. But you can also see on this image here that we still have our Fresnel lens. You can see the little pieces of the lens up here. This device is another one of these crazy high-tech inventions, and this is the schematic for it over here. It is called a lamp changer. So we actually have a bunch of light bulbs that are set up on a device. As one bulb burns out, that circuit is broken. This machine automatically realizes a light bulb has burnt out, and it rotates the next light bulb right into place, and that one flips on. So we are getting into a really modernized lighthouse, and for the time, for 1933, I mean, that is some really cutting-edge technology. And the other thing, just for my own reminder, I put a little, like a radio signal up here, and in 1933, we are starting to convert that little summer kitchen that is next to the keeper's quarters to be a radio station. And don't think like two-way radio, hey you, this is me. This is essentially a broadcast, a very rudimentary broadcast signal that can be picked up by ships, same type of thing. You basically think of like Morse code, that each of these radio stations up and down the coast will have a different, this one's ... etc. So you can pick up, without even visually identifying, you can pick up that you are in the vicinity of a certain lighthouse. Based on the chart, you can figure out what that lighthouse is. And this is, in my opinion, that first step towards the really modern navigation like GPS, where I don't even really need a visual identifier. I'm just picking up stuff out of thin air to tell me where I'm at. 1939, this becomes more important later, but essentially the control of the lighthouse and the lighthouse service dissolves and becomes part of the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard ultimately takes over as the controlling factor for the lighthouse. So 1939, you guys can guess what's coming up. So this is a paper from December 11th. This is 4 days after Pearl Harbor. Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. Italy, I'm not so concerned about. Germany is the big one for us here on the east coast of the United States. So once this war breaks out, Germany basically declares unrestricted submarine warfare. So we have the Battle of the Atlantic, and you basically have roughly the first 6 months or so of 1942, just a shooting gallery on any shipping on the east coast of the United States. It's incredibly problematic. I would love to talk more about it, but again, I'm trying to stay semi-narrowly focused on the lighthouse. Just know that during this time period, there is a massively increased military presence out in the area by the lighthouse. We actually have a whole military camp that kind of pops up out there in terms of coastal protection. And I've got this picture over here, and this is not from the top of the lighthouse, but it's the only one that kind of fit the mold. This is a picture from that time period and from Cape Lookout of a spotter. So the Cape Lookout Lighthouse is, the light is shut off. It takes quite a long time. It takes several months for them to decide that they're going to shut it off. By June or so, it's shut off. And the lighthouse actually turns into a submarine lookout station. So you have members of the military who are up there trying to spot submarines off the coast and then radio that information to their colleagues to let them know they're there. Jumping forward, now we're getting into some really heavy-duty modernization. So 1949, so this is that summer kitchen. Again, in 1933, very rudimentary radio signals being transmitted from there. In 49, they drastically improved that. You can actually still kind of see the concrete blocks that are used to support these two radio towers, and that is displayed over here. If you can see, you got one radio tower in front of the summer kitchen, one radio tower off to the side, and there actually is a wire between them that is transmitting that information. Same thing, a little bit more of a modernized version of this electric signal that's being sent out to ships to let them know you're here. So even in incredibly inclement weather, when you couldn't even see the lighthouse, if you were a mile away, you still will be receiving that signal and have a rough idea that you are approaching the Cape Lookout Lighthouse. The other thing that happens in 1950 is we actually have a full automation of the light, meaning we no longer need a keeper out there to be maintaining the light. It basically runs entirely on its own. You just have to keep the generator full of fuel, make sure if something burns out, you go and replace it, but it's completely automated, and we actually lose that physical presence of a keeper on site. The problem with automation is that without having somebody out there who is actively running it and living in these buildings, the buildings basically start to degrade. They're not being used, and if you notice here, there's a building missing from that previous picture. So it's during this time window that the Coast Guard is essentially accessing some of these buildings. That 1907 Keeper's Quarters that some of you may know as the Barton House is ultimately moved a little over a mile down the beach down south. Essentially, it's excess property from the Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard actually had plans to potentially just demolish some of these buildings because they were not in use. And so that leads me to that right in that time period, 1976, we get the new light up in the lighthouse. Fantastic. We have 2,000-watt arrow beacons that are facing outward, rotating to create a flash pattern every 15 seconds. This is a very large light setup, and the problem with a very large light, even though it's incredibly bright, is that it does not fit neatly inside our Fresnel lens. So this is a sad day in Cape Lookout Lighthouse history, because we lose our Fresnel lens. So the Fresnel lens, and again, Coast Guard is the one who is managing all this. The Park Service is actually, the park is really being established this year, 1976, but we are completely hands-off, no involvement with the buildings out there, or especially with the lighthouse, all managed by the Coast Guard. So they actually pull the Fresnel lens, install this new high-quality light, and the Fresnel lens goes up to Portsmouth, Virginia, to the 5th District Coast Guard headquarters, and is on display there for an extended period of time. We'll talk about what happens with that here in a little bit. 1976, as I mentioned, the National Seashore is formed, so we were authorized by Congress about 10 years earlier in 1966, but the actual first founding of the park is in 1976. A couple years later, there is some potential hope for those buildings and the light station. And my understanding, I don't know a ton about it, this is just talking with our current superintendent, Jeff West. The superintendent, Barbie, who is, I think, the first superintendent, basically made a push to try and get those buildings around the light station on the National Register of Historic Places, which potentially creates funding and allows for preservations of buildings. And so that actually happens in 1978. So we'll jump forward, 82. So in 82, the Coast Guard station out there, just a couple miles south of the lighthouse, closes down. But one thing that comes with the closure of that Coast Guard station is the lack of somebody out there to do that very basic stuff of refilling the fuel in the generator and just making sure things are running. So in 82, we also get our new power source, which is this undersea cable stretched from Harker's Island right there by the Park Service Visitor Center just behind the building. There's a big green box. I think the box is still there, but there's no more cabling leaving it. But we actually have a hard line from the mainland going out to power the lighthouse. And at that point, you no longer need somebody from the Coast Guard station coming over to check the fuel sources and make sure everything is operational. So we'll jump forward. 1988. Again, I went through and dug out a whole bunch of different news articles, but we basically have some pretty serious maintenance issues going on in the lighthouse in the late 80s. I love this here. So they talk about budget cuts and they don't have the money, but then they've got this quote from Stephen Phillips, a technician with the Coast Guard in Portsmouth, Virginia. He says, "I'm sure they would like us to do a major renovation, but we're lucky to get the funds to paint it," which I just think is so telling for how things are going across the board. So they are struggling to get the funds to actually do the repairs to it. And you get some work done, but things take a long time for them to happen, which is unfortunately a recurring theme. So back to the Fresnel lens. 1994. Coast Guard sends it up to Block Island Lighthouse in Rhode Island. You can actually go up and see it. It is inside the lighthouse. So this is a picture. That's our Fresnel lens. You know what frustrates me the most? We'll talk about that in a minute. What frustrates me the most about this, and I didn't know this until maybe like a week ago. I'm just chatting with the superintendent about strategizing about what we can do to get the Fresnel lens back. And he says, their original Fresnel lens, you know where it is? And I was like, no, in someone else's lighthouse? He said, no, it's in their visitor center right next to the lighthouse. They've got 2 Fresnel lenses. Do you really need 2? I don't know. Yeah, right? So, we'll get to it. I don't want to jump too far into the future, but our Fresnel lens is currently installed in the Block Island Lighthouse. So we'll jump into the 21st century, June 14th, 2003. The National Park Service assumes control of the lighthouse and the light station. So this is the pictures up top is the change of command ceremony here. One thing I added, they had a ceremonial stamp. And you can see right here, this is that same summer kitchen actually becomes a United States post office for just one day and has a line wrapped around the lighthouse of people who want to buy these commemorative stamps of the Cape Lookout Lighthouse. But this is the point where the National Park Service starts to be in control of the lighthouse. And very shortly thereafter, we start doing special occasion climbs a couple times a year. National Lighthouse Day, Coast Guard Appreciation Day, those kinds of things for special occasions. The one thing I'll point out, if you look behind, this is a park volunteer here, look behind in the gaps here, realize there's nothing. I love this picture of this, I'm assuming the dad holding on to the kid with just a giant opening there. So a little, I don't know if that would pass our current safety regulations. And so in 2009, we have some safety repairs. And what is the first thing you notice? That, hey, maybe we should put some grates on this thing so we don't have a human-sized hole that somebody can fall through while they're up here on a tour. So with safety repairs, there's a couple things that happen. You get this nice new grating on the outside. You can kind of see the red in the image here. It's rusted. Metal does not last very long out there at the Cape. You got maybe 5 to 10 years, depending on how well you take care of it. But the grading helps a lot. The other thing that I heard anecdotally from somebody who was out there during that time is that if you climb the stairs, every now and then one of the stairs would feel like you were stepping on a trampoline because it was so loose in the brick that it was basically just friction holding it in place. So they replaced some of those stairs as well. Just a general, not a massive overhaul, but some basic safety things to make sure that people could climb the lighthouse without injuring themselves. So July 15th, 2010 is when we actually open for public climbing. So not just 1 or 2 times a year. We now have rangers who are out there who are sending people up into the lighthouse at groups of 10 at a time with a ranger or volunteer at the top, someone in the middle, someone at the bottom. I'm sure most of you have probably climbed under these circumstances where you're basically just a conveyor belt of people constantly in and out of the lighthouse. During this same time period, we're doing those daily climbs, but we are also doing programs called Evening at the Cape. I think they technically start around 2013 or so, but this is what I would call our flagship program. It is absolutely my favorite program at the park. These are basically a sunset cruise. You're headed out just before the sun sets, and you start climbing the lighthouse as the sun is setting, and you can end up with these fantastic pictures up there seeing the sunset from the top of the lighthouse. One of the things, and as the new chief of interpretation, I have a lot of ability to sort of mold how things are going into the future, but the experience of this Evening at the Cape program resonated so much with me and so much with visitors in terms of feedback that we would get, that I really want to turn our future lighthouse operation into something that's a little more catered and feels a little bit less like you're just on a conveyor belt to the top of the lighthouse. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So in the middle of this, 2017, this is almost exactly when I started at the park, we have this transition to solar power. So this is the process there. That's Steve Sable, one of our old maintenance supervisors, flipping the switch. I found out after the fact that the switch literally wasn't connected to anything. It was just a photo op. I was so upset. I was like, it's not on, it's not on. They're like, oh, it's not ready yet. It'll take us a little while. But this is our new light. This is the light that's currently up in there. It's a high output LED. Same thing, it's set up to flash every 15 seconds. As many of you, I'm sure, know, because I received calls from all over the community, it is not nearly as bright or as cool as the previous light setup, which is all the more reason why Block Island should give us back our Fresnel lens. Yeah, well, you can. I think the superintendent and I may make a visit up there at some point. Hey guys, you really need to? So 2020, you guys can probably guess why we closed in 2020. Pandemic shut everything down. I won't go too much into that, but basically what happens in 2021, before we start any major operation that involves the public, the Rangers are going to do safety walkthroughs of our facilities. So we are starting that safety walkthrough in 2021. One of the Rangers basically identifies a large segment of rust on one of the stairs that looked like it was potentially compromising structural stability. As soon as he reported that, it's a full... Everything stops, and then we do a much more thorough walkthrough involving structural engineers and everything else. And they basically, so we get all the way up to the top, and the structural engineers are using mirrors and cameras and stuff and looking underneath. And they're like, are you putting people on this? And we're like, well, we plan to. And they're like, you shouldn't do that. You should probably repair this before you put people on it. And it's the same thing that I talked about a minute ago. It's rust, right? Everything made out of metal rusts out there, and it is just an ongoing factor. So I put up this right here. This is the cover page and the first couple of pages of a 500-page contract to do major repairs to the lighthouse. So this is why the lighthouse has been closed for a couple years. So I put a couple, and there was much more than what I talked about, but the track record has been to do these sort of band-aid approaches. Okay, this particular thing is broken, completely replace that thing. Okay, now this is broken, replace that. And so what we're looking to do is a really comprehensive, ground-up, complete restoration of the lighthouse. So we're talking stripping all the paint off for the first time since 1873, repainting it with high-quality, breathable paint, because the engineers came out and said your bricks have too much moisture and they're going to lose stability as a result. We're talking interior, replacing all of those rusted stairs and handrails with freshly made ones. We're talking all the wood for the stairs that's going up to it being rebuilt, mortar work, brick work, the entire top portion of the light, which really just is a metal structure that sort of sits on top of the brick. That entire thing is going to come off piece by piece, go down to a foundry in Alabama, I think, and is going to be piece by piece reconstructed out of fresh metal and then brought back and then rebuilt in place. And as far as I know, that has never happened since the lighthouse was made. And there's a lot of pieces of it that if you look at the pictures of it, you can tell that it is in dire shape. There was a tiny hole about the size of a piece of pencil lead by the hatch when I started in 2017. And by the time we closed it in 2020, I could fit 2 fingers through it. So that's just one anecdotal story of rust expanding in a pretty short span of time. We're talking 5 years. You go from a piece of pencil lead to I can put 2 fingers into it. So it's a major restoration. It is going to take some time. So I have a proposed timeline here. My guess is, so we have gotten through all of the kind of contracting stuff like that. My guess is we actually have hammer swinging sometime next year. They are physically working on the lighthouse in all those different components. I'm guessing about 18 to 24 months after that, we will have completed the construction portion of it, And my hope is that either in late 26 we can do like a partial season, worst case scenario, early 2027 we are reopening with those ranger guided tours of the lighthouse. As I talked about having plans and intentions for what those tours are going to look like, I really want to get away from that conveyor belt feeling of like just getting pushed up the lighthouse. You've got your few minutes up here, now it's time to leave. It doesn't feel like an experience to me. And so one of the things that we're looking at doing is incorporating a recent repair to the summer kitchen. So this is that same 1907 summer kitchen. I've got some before and afters. So these before pictures right here are immediately after Hurricane Florence. We lost probably 30% of the siding on the building, completely lost the roof. When I went and looked at it in our post-storm assessment, there was more visible blue sky through the roof than there was actual cedar shingles on it. It was incredibly rough shape, and basically if we didn't start doing something about it, it very well could have fallen over. So we put together an all-volunteer team to restore this particular building. These are our volunteers here. They were our volunteers of the year last year. You guys, I encourage you to go online, read the story about the construction project. Over the course of 4 years, they took this building that was in shambles and completely restored it. I don't have pictures here because I want it to be kind of a grand reveal, but they actually made it better than it was when they started. They have restored the interior too. My long-term dream is that when we do reopen in 26, 27, the interior of the summer kitchen is a museum set, we think, in the 1917 era, where you can get a little taste in terms of like living history of what a summer kitchen would have looked like during that time period. Unfortunately, I don't have any photographs of this particular summer kitchen, but there's a wealth of knowledge of what summer kitchens look like in other areas of the United States. So the plan is, rather than just you're here for your little trip up the lighthouse, that it'll be a catered experience where you're actually there with a ranger or a volunteer who walks through this whole process with you and really guides you through an experience of what it would be like to be not only a keeper of the light, but just somebody who is out here, separated from everything and working with really minimal resources. So that's the dream. 2028? Fernell Lins comes home. I don't know, maybe. Seriously, Block Island, you really need to? It's a dream, and I think there actually is. I think it has a little more possibility now that we have the LED light in there, and it's substantially smaller. In terms of it being an active navigational aid, which it is, so we, the National Park Service, we run that whole building, the entire lighthouse is all us, but that light at the top, that's the Coast Guard's. It's a navigational aid. So now I and the superintendent potentially have a little bit of ammunition to say we actually, for a legitimate purpose, could use the Fernell Lins because it will amplify the light from our current light in there. So there's at least the ability to negotiate, and we'll see what we can do. It's a dream, and that's all we can do is dream. So that's all I got. Thank you so much for coming out and listening to me babble about the lighthouse.